accepted.
All right, good morning. Thanks for being here this early. My name is Venkat Subramaniam. I'm going to be talking about code review, you said. So let's talk about reviewing code. I know that's not something that we all get excited about too often, but what I want to do here today is to share with you some of my experience over the past few decades. And I worked on projects that have succeeded. I worked on projects that have failed. And even within applications we created, there are parts that are very successful, parts that are not. And if you ask me, over the past about 30 plus years I've been writing code, if there is one thing I can pinpoint to and say, this really has been effective, I do have to say, among a lot of practices we all like to think about and promote, one thing that stands out for me is code review. And I'll be absolutely honest about it. It's not that I came up with any of these ideas in general, but I've been really interested in following some of the suggestions that people around me really wanted me to follow when I was a very young developer. And looking back, I'll be absolutely honest about it. It was not fun to do some of these things in projects I worked on. And yet, of course, your supervisor is telling you to do stuff, you put a little benefit of doubt, and you try things. And then as I moved on in my career, and not only was I still writing code, but I was managing projects as well. And what did I want to do on my own projects when I had the ability to decide the practices we want to bring in? I was quite pleasantly surprised that I brought in code review as one of the things we did for the teams that I was helping to develop software. And the reason really for that is the benefits I've seen with code reviews over time. But of course, what I want to also talk about to you today is not just code reviews, but some of the things that I've also managed to learn along the way and start doing when I start writing code. Maybe some of the things you can take back to your own teams. If you're doing those things, that's absolutely great. You can continue to do them with a lot more effort. If there are things you probably pick up here that you're not doing, maybe I hope that you would consider maybe implementing some of those things. But I want to, first of all, make a confession before I go further. And I think it's important to be honest about what we do. So here is my confession, and I'll be very blunt and honest about it. I write terrible code. And if you ever look at the code I write, you would be very shocked and surprised. You would say, oh my gosh, I cannot believe it. You speak so much about coding. How come your code sucks so bad? Well, I'll be absolutely honest. I cannot write good code. But then I found something very special about myself. While I cannot write good code, I'm absolutely great in finding fault with other people's code. And this I found out to be amazingly great quality. So I don't pretend to write good code anymore. I write crappy code, give it to somebody while they're kicking and screaming. I kick and scream about their code. And at the end of the day, we collectively can write better quality code. And what I realized over time is, this goes back to several years. This is one of the very first books I ever wrote. And I was working on writing software at the time commercially. And I got really excited about wanting to write a book. And the very first book I wrote, didn't know the experience writing books, what does it really mean? And my very first experience writing book was rather very unique. I was sitting at my desk, honestly. I'm a bit crazy like a lot of us are. And as I was sitting at my desk and writing code, I was thinking about, gosh, I really want to give a talk in the local user group. What would I want to talk about? And suddenly I got an idea for a topic I want to talk about. So I wrote up a quick abstract, sent it to the user group leader and said, hey, here's a talk I would like to give. Think about it, and let me know if you want me to give this talk. And honestly, a second later, I thought to myself, whoa, that's kind of an interesting topic for a book to write. And this is from a person who has never written a book before. And I said, this is a topic for a book to write. And I immediately searched on the web to see if there was a book on the topic. And there was no book on the topic. And this thought was so overwhelming, I'm not exaggerating, I started writing the book right then. And I didn't stop until 2 weeks later when I finished writing the book. So I wrote my first book in about 2 weeks, and I've almost written all my books in 2 weeks since then, because it's great to just sit and write it. And when I finished writing, I went and contacted O'Reilly, and I said I would like to really write a book, and here's a proposal. They took about a month or so. They came back and said, we really like this book. When do you think you can finish writing? I said, I can send it to you now. And they said, no, we approved your book. It's all great. When do you think you can send us the book? I said, I can send it to you now. And the person said, clearly we're not communicating properly. Let me help you understand. We approved your proposal. We don't need anything from you now. We're talking about the real book. When will you start writing? How many months would you take? I said, okay, I think I know what the problem here is. Hang on a second. And I emailed him the book, and I said, can you please take a look at it? And then he looked at it and said, okay, this is different. Nobody writes a book and comes to us. I said, I'm sorry, I didn't know how to write a book, so I wrote it. And of course, then begins the fun part when they send it for the technical review. And I had one technical reviewer, especially, who was amazingly good in the review. And he was sending the reviews back to me. And one day I emailed him and said, hey, could I ask you a favor, please? Can you just pause for 5 minutes so I can wipe the blood off my nose? And he said, oh my gosh, I don't want you to feel insulted in my reviews. I said, no. I would rather you punch me on the nose than the readers punch me on the nose. This was an aha moment for me, because when I gave the book for review, the perspectives I got back from the person was just amazing. I'm into my 15th book right now, but if you ask me what's one thing I do, the publishers typically say, oh, get about 3 reviews. I typically get about 30 reviews. And the reason I do that is because I see the absolute value in the perspectives of the people reading the book, reading the code, and giving us those feedback to say, well, this can actually be different. This can actually be better. And I can pinpoint the names of the people, honestly, from whom I've learned over the past 30 years, because they showed me something I never even thought was possible. And that's absolutely amazing to know that we can actually think differently and benefit from that. So this is one of the reasons why I place reviews as one of the topmost qualities I think we can go off as a developer, because in a way that it really is a way for us to get the different perspectives and ideas that one single person almost will never be able to think about in those regards. The first law of programming says that lowering quality lengthens the development time. So if you really want to go slower, you want to really write poor quality code. But I don't think we have to put a lot of effort for it, I think. It comes naturally for most of us to write poor quality code. But the point really is that is going to slow us down quite a bit. So if you want to really go fast, you have to really think about quality. And I'm a big fan of the phrase, sometimes you have to slow down in order for you to gain speed. If you don't slow down when you have to slow down, you may end up in the ditch, and it's not going to give you the speed later on. So sometimes we have to slow down in order for us to gain speed. But having said that, though, one of the reasons I want to think about quality of code is we cannot be agile if our code sucks. You are sitting there in a meeting and you hear somebody talk about, oh, we got to make change to this XYZ module. And now you're thinking in the back of your head, wait, the last time somebody touched the XYZ module, the entire team couldn't go home for the weekend. We are not going to do this change anymore, right? So naturally, we begin to resist change when the code quality is poor. So if you want to be agile, you really want to think about code quality. But of course, talking about agile, let's talk about agile development. Well, when I started programming way back in time, we did waterfall development. And we did waterfall development, and we called it waterfall development. Today, a lot of people do waterfall development, but they call it agile development, because that just makes them feel good. But I want to ask the question, what is really agile development? What does it really mean to be agile? When I go to companies, they immediately tell me, oh, Venkat, we want you to know we do agile development. I often say, that's great, thanks for letting me know. Now let's get to the real work you do. So we have this buzz of agile development. What does it really mean to do agile development? Well, I think we can have a good answer, right? It's about that stand-up meeting. Every day we get together and we do a stand-up meeting. I was in Devoxx, Belgium a couple of months ago, and I was walking to the conference. There were a few ducks doing stand-up meeting as well. I kind of took a photo and posted, even ducks are agile these days. So if all that it takes to be agile is stand-up meeting, that's very easy. We can do stand-up meetings, isn't it? So no, that's not it. So then I thought about it. Then what is agile development? Oh, it's got to be you doing Scrum, isn't it? Because if you do Scrum, it's agile, absolutely. And in fact, I have a client who calls the Scrum fall rather than waterfall. And things are really, really hard when things don't actually work. And we have this, desire to just do things because everybody else is doing it. So no, it's not Scrum. What else could it be? Oh, I got a thought. It's got to be velocity, right? Because velocity is the most important thing we have to go after. This, again, doesn't really make any sense to me. Because if you really want speed, I shouldn't give you speed in the beginning. Because if I give you speed in the beginning, I can give you speed by lowering quality. I can give you speed by doing easy things. And that to me is very scary. Because when things really become complex, we slow down to a grinding halt, and that's no good. So speed is the least interesting thing for me. What is really important in agile development for me is sustainable speed. That's what I really want. And that word sustainability, I put more than speed. I want sustainable speed. So no, it's not velocity. Well, then what could it really be? I think we finally figured this out as the industry, I think. It is really about having a Scrum Master. That's what it really is, isn't it? And this, again, I have no clue. When I go to companies, somebody comes to me very proudly and says, I'm a Scrum Master. I always am really sorry to hear it. This was never intended to be. It was never intended to be really a position. And people find genius ways to find things to do so they can avoid doing real work. So this is, again, doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. With all respect to Scrum Masters, I would say move on. So essentially, that doesn't make any sense also. So what does it really mean to do agile development? And I would say, number one, it really is feedback-driven development. So agile development is really about feedback-driven development. You want to drive your development based on feedback cycles. You want to know not just what you have done, but you want to know where you are going. And this reminds me of an experience I would never forget. 30 years ago, 1993, I took my very first trip to the Grand Canyon with my wife, and we just celebrated the 30 years going to Grand Canyon. About a month ago, we went back to Grand Canyon just to celebrate the time that's passed since the time I went there first. And since then, I've been to Grand Canyon several times, and I'm hoping to go again a few more times as well. But the very first time I went to Grand Canyon, like I said, it was 1993, the world was very different. A lot of us are today in the world of using smartphones and all those wonderful devices. Back then, we didn't have smartphones. This always puzzles my children. They kind of look at me and say, Dad, what do you mean there were no smartphones when you were a kid? I'm like, yeah, we didn't have smartphones. Then they find out that there was no Google when I was a kid. And then they look at me and says, Dad, you lived when there's no smartphones, when there were no Google. How did you escape those dinosaurs, they ask me. So it's really hard for people to even imagine that humans once lived without all these things. But I went to the wonderful city of Phoenix, Arizona, started driving down to Grand Canyon, which was about 4 hours drive, give or take. And I was driving for about 2 hours, and as you know, Grand Canyon is a hole on the ground. It's not a mountain you can look up from a distance to know if you're going in the right direction. So I'm driving for about 2 hours, and all of a sudden I'm like, gosh, am I driving in the right direction? I didn't know. So I parked my car on the side of the road, and I looked around 360 degrees of nothing but flat land for, however far the eyes can see. And there's nobody around to really ask any question. And you're in the middle of a desert, and I'm like, gosh, am I heading in the right direction or not? And I had two choices. I can keep going, wondering if I'm still heading in the right direction or not, or I can start driving back for maybe an hour until I meet civilization. I can ask them, was I going in the right direction? And they may say, yes, you were, and I can drive back again that hour I lost. So I was kind of puzzled and thinking, what should I do? And you might say, oh, Venkat, didn't you have a map really with you when you started traveling? Oh, sure, I had a map. Those days, the maps used to be in paper, and I put the map on the dashboard, and I was looking at it, and of course, I know exactly where Phoenix is, I know exactly where Grand Canyon is. There was only one thing this map was missing, and you know what that is, right? It's that blue dot on it. And that blue dot is the most amazing feature of any map, and damn it, they didn't have it back then. And today, of course, like last month when I went to Grand Canyon, I didn't have to look up anything. I just said Grand Canyon on my smartphone, started driving, and the blue dot was telling me how far I have to go. And more important, it told me how long it'll be before I can get there. So that is really the most vital thing. What if we can have that blue dot on everything we do, which is the feedback that we really are talking about? So agile development is really about a feedback-driven development. But there are different types of feedback we often will benefit from. So what are some of the feedback that we will really benefit from? Well, the very first feedback I really enjoy when I do agile development, or when I do development rather, is to really have feedback from active users. When I co-authored the book, Practice of an Agile Developer, with Andy Hunt, Andy asked me the question, hey, we're writing the epilogue, what do you think we should recommend that we do? And I came with all kinds of nonsense that I would probably want to say, and he read through that and said, no, I'm not really convinced. Then he asked a question which is, writing a book is really hard a lot of times because you have a mental shift, and sometimes you have to just let go of those things, as I was learning to write books back then. And then he asked the question, what do you do in your development? Well, that was a very different question. The first question was, what do you want to tell your readers? But the question now was, what do you actually do in your development? Oh, I said, well, that's very simple. I develop the product I'm developing, but in every stage of development, like every week, I give the application to my users, and I watch them kick and scream every week. And he said, that's it. That's what I was looking for. And then the next day, I look at the change he has made, and he said, demo and exercise. So essentially, the idea is, the real feedback comes from active use of a product. If you go to somebody and say, let me do a demo, that's a dog and pony show. You can show everything you are happy with. They can look at it and throw aside certain ideas. But if you give them something and say, go ahead and use it, and the minute they touch your product and start using it, now you get real feedback. So one nice feedback we can get from application development is feedback from active use of products. So I want people to use my application from very early on. And to emphasize this, for example, in one of the applications I was developing, my client was far away from where I was. We get excited about remote development after the pandemic. I'm talking about 20 years ago. This is even before the Agile Manifesto was written. And I had a client who was remote at that time, and I didn't have the ability to go see and sit next to the client and work with them. And so I first contacted the client, and I said, hey, I really want to succeed on this product. And the client laughed and said, we too would like to succeed on it. I said, that's great. Now we have a team that is keen on succeeding. How do we do this? And I said to them, well, I'm going to do this in a slightly different way than what products normally do, and that is, every week I'm going to send you a release of the code I have written, and your job is to let your people, the users, use it. And I want you to give me, in 24 hours, I want you to tell me 3 things. I want you to tell me, what did you really like about it? You always want a positive feedback. What did you like? And what do you think we should improve, right? Constructive criticism. So what do you like? What should be improved? And third, what do you want me to focus on between now and the next time I send you this within a week? Well, we worked on this project, and This was about 6 months of effort. We finished it. And when I completed the project, it was supposed to be done in November. We actually finished it about a couple of weeks before that. And a good 2 months went by, and I got a knock on my door at my office, and I look up this person. I didn't know who that person was. And she said, I'm from the accounts receivable department. I'm like, wow, I've got a visitor from accounts. That's great. And I said, hey, how's it going? And she said, you're in trouble, mister. And I said, oh my gosh, what did I do to cause problem for the company? And she said, well, you were supposed to work on a product in our company. The standard practice is we release the product, and you have 2 months to 6 months to finish bug fixing. And then when you finish the bug fixing, the client says bugs are fixed, and they release the rest of the payment for us. So my record shows we got 50% of the payment. We haven't received the other 50%. And looking at the communication, you haven't really spent the time on the product fixing bugs. Looks like you're in trouble now. And I said, oh my gosh, I'm so glad to hear this. There is no bugs to fix. And she literally laughed the loudest I've heard. And she said, that's crazy. We always fix bugs. And I said, I'm really sorry I'm disappointing you, but here's the phone number. Let's call the person on the other side. She calls the manager on the other side, and he says, oh yeah, we have been having this application in production for a while now. In fact, we put it into production even before it was released, and we're very happy. Let me know what papers I need to sign. I'll sign it. And she left the room in complete disbelief. She's like, something is weird going on here. How could you work on a product that actually people are happy using? I'm like, sorry, I didn't know what I was doing, so I did it this way. So the point really is that I've really gained on that feedback cycle. When active users give us feedback, that's the best kind of feedback we can ever have. So I put into production way early before anything is really considered to be complete, if you will. But then the next type of feedback we can benefit greatly is to have automated tests on the application. Automated tests give us an ability for us to know that the code that worked yesterday continues to work today. Maybe you've had this experience as well, which I find very annoying, by the way. The code always does what I type, not what I meant, which is very annoying, right? Because that's not what I meant, but the compiler says, but that's what you typed. And you really want to know that you are communicating the real intent in the code. When you make a change to the software, you want to know that it still works. And software is a nonlinear system. You change something over here, and something completely over here in a different place falls apart. The only good thing that comes out of that is we laugh about it a few weeks later at the party. And it's never really easy and very frustrating, of course, when it happens and we need to deal with it. So automated feedback loops can be extremely helpful. But then there's a third type of review we can use. We can use the customer's feedback. We can use automated tests. But I would say, for me, one other type of feedback is really the code reviews. Now, you say, wait a second, did you say code review? Are you out of your mind? I don't think anyone really enjoys doing code reviews or being part of a code review. Part of the reason for that really is that we started doing code review really terribly, and there is a lot of negative connotation attached to it. So one of the problems is a lot of times people say we want to do code review, and they bring a small group into a room, they project the code on the screen, and they start talking about it. And this is a terrible experience for a lot of people in general. We all dread this experience of code review, and every single part of the team that is involved in it ends up really disliking it. But why is that really? Well, the developers never seem to like it. Nobody likes for their code to be on the wall, and everybody is pointing at it and talking about it. And sometimes we even want to call in sick the day that they're going to do code review. I don't want to be at work because that's going to be really an insult. I don't want to be listening to it. So we don't like code reviews. But in the meantime, you probably sent an email as a team lead saying there's going to be a code review on Thursday, and the the manager comes running down and says, did you just send an email that there's going to be a code review this Thursday? And you said, yeah. And the manager says, heck no. The last time we had a code review, there was a fight and we had to call the cops and 2 people quit. No more code review for you. So nobody really likes code review because it's very contentious and people end up really fighting with each other. That's not very productive. And the entire team really takes the burden on it, and you have seen people probably leave or quit because of all the emotional baggage that gets developed over time. So this is a completely disastrous process. So how can we really then benefit from this in the long run is the question. But I would first say a good code reflects empathy. And this is one of the most important characteristics I think we should think about when it comes to code. Because when you look at a piece of code, you are really reflecting empathy. A code is how you tell your colleagues how you feel about them. Do you love them? Or do you hate them all? And I'm sure you've had your experiences with code. I'm a consultant, so I go work with different teams in different companies, and quite often I would be looking at a code or a design which has really gone bad. And the code is doing all kinds of stuff you shouldn't really be doing. And I oftentimes would look at their lead developer or architect and say, why did you guys write the code like this? And I almost always get this infamous response from them. They look at me and say, Venkat, you need to know this code was written before I joined the company, right? It's always the case. They want to know, I'm the victim here. I was not part of this particular code. And so they want to distance themselves from it. Well, but a code reflects empathy. You want to ask yourselves, how does it feel to read this code? So there is always a developer at the other end of your push. And it is that human that you want to always think about. If you think about it, if you think about a civilized society, what do we do in a civilized society? You are walking down and you see those double doors, and you push the double door, and you step out, and ever so gently, as a civilized human, you may not even think about it, you may not even realize it. As you push the door and step away, for just a moment, you hold the door, and then you walk away. Because you don't want the door to sling back on the face of the person, that stranger behind you. So when you push the door, you are always thinking about the person right behind you, and that's exactly what happens when you push the code as well. You don't want to hit the person on the face who is trying to pull your code on the other side. So it's always about thinking, how do they feel in taking this code and maintaining it? That is something we want to think about. But it's easy to say this then to actually do quite often. But this is where I really feel code review really can help us. To chime in the words of Newton, Newton is known to have said that he really has this phrase called standing on the shoulders of giants. Well, in this context, he says the great Newton did all the things he did because he says he learned from people that came before him immensely. And so he was being very humble and saying, well, yes, I've done all these wonderful laws that I've created, but my work is really a reflection of things I've learned from other people who came before me. That, I think, is extremely important for us to think about because we can also benefit from standing on the shoulders of giants. And I can definitely tell you in my life, it's not only that I've stood on the top of the shoulder of the giants, I literally walk and run on their shoulders. They've been carrying me through for the past several decades. So we can greatly benefit from other people who are genuinely interested in helping us to get better as well. But I would say asking for review is really a reflection of humility. So it really is a way for us to understand that, yes, we are good in what we do, what we know, but it's okay to really know that other people can have a different perspective. Other people can have a different idea, and we can listen, and we can consider at least. I'm not saying we should do everything that other people tell us, but at least to have that ability to listen is extremely important. And it's your mind telling you it's okay to learn and improve. That's what it really means, asking for code review, is to really say it's okay to learn, it's okay to improve. And that, to me, is not easy in the beginning, because the problem with a lot of us in our societies is we don't really get appreciated for asking for help. We don't get appreciated for saying, hey, I've done this, can you take a look at it? But it's, one of the advice I often give for people is be absolutely shameless. It's okay to really learn from others. So if you ask for somebody to review your work, that's great. We can only improve what we do. And this reminds me of an experience I had with a gentleman, and he said, code reviews either make you smarter or make you a hero. And I said, well, that's interesting. What does it mean it makes you smarter or makes you a hero? And he said, well, when you ask for a code review, there are times when the person who is reviewing the code doesn't know about a particular idea or approach, and they come to you and say, whoa, I was reviewing your code, I learned something I didn't know before. Well, that little moment makes you a hero. There are times when I would go to the person whose code I'm reviewing and I would say, hey, I'm reviewing your code, but I didn't even know you could actually do this. That's pretty awesome. I learned something. Well, that person is a hero because I was able to learn something from that person when they was reviewing their code. But on the same note, it can also really help you to become smarter, because a lot of times, you can get a review from somebody and they say, hey, you can do this in a different way, and now you learn something you didn't know before that you could do, and you can modify your code, know a different approach, do a better way. So it is really a two-way street. Others can learn from you, and you can learn from them as well when a code is being reviewed. So both the parties involved in the review often really benefit from this. So in my observation, I would say, code reviews are the next best to pair rotation and pair programming. I'm a huge fan of pair programming. And in opportunities where we have done pair programming, we often do pair rotation. We don't get together and pair with each other for an extended period of time. We keep rotating pair on a daily basis or even more frequently, and that's really effective. But if you don't have an ability to do pair programming and pair rotation, more important, or your situation doesn't permit it, I would say code reviews are the next best thing you can provide. But keep in mind that code reviews are both technical and sociological in what we do. So you cannot simply focus on technical details and walk away. It doesn't work. And you're not just reviewing the code, you are reviewing the person who wrote the code as well. We got to be extremely sensitive about it, and that becomes extremely critical for us to provide a good review and build the team as well. But what are really the benefits of doing these kinds of code reviews? Let's expand into some of these things. For a person who is writing the code, you are asking for somebody to review the code. Well, there are a few benefits you derive immediately. First is you have another pair of eyes that are reviewing your code. Oh, coming to that one, real quick, I mentioned earlier how code reviews are really not effective when you bring the team together and ask them to review it. So here is one of the things I've been practicing for a while now, which is called a tactical code review. So what I mean by tactical code review is, I write a piece of code, now I ask Joseph to review my code. And the next time I write a piece of code, I'm going to ask Sarah to review my code. So we're going to rotate among the people who are going to review the code. So just one other person reviews the code, but we rotate the person who reviews the code in our team. So we don't bring an entire team into the room to review it, just one person reviews the code. For the writer, of course, you get another pair of eyes to review the code. You are able to make the code actually readable, because when somebody is reviewing the code, they're actually reading it, and they immediately talk about, is it understandable? Is it cohesive? Should we break the function into smaller functions to make it really easier to understand, easier to follow? What about variable names? Are they good? They're going to start giving feedback on readability of the code. And also, we can learn from our colleagues because they are able to tell us, hey, why don't you rename this way? Why don't you break this method into smaller methods? We are constantly learning from the feedback they are providing. So you are actually going to be better. Not only the code is going to be better, you're going to be better at it as well. But let's be honest about it. I am a big fan of being selfish. Being selfish is not a bad thing because being selfish means you really care about you as well. So be selfish. And so it's perfectly okay to ask the question, what's in it for me? If I'm going to take the time to review somebody's code, yes, they may benefit, the product may benefit, but what's in it for me to review the code? And the answer to that question is, first, you're helping other people to learn. There is a little bit of, well, I'm part of others to learn, giving back as I learn from others as well. So that's a good thing. So you're helping others to learn. But also is you can learn from others about things you did not even know was possible. I remember one day reviewing a piece of code, and I looked at a particular way of solving a problem. I went to the developer and I said, hey, I'm reviewing your code. I did not know you could actually do this. The approach I know is actually more verbose and error-prone, but you somehow found this library to use, and it's so concise. I love it. And that kind of feedback is genuine because I truly learned from that experience reviewing their code. So I gained in the process of reviewing the code. That's definitely better. It also helps us to get familiar with the application overall. If you're working in a collective environment, what is a better way for you to know what different parts of the code is doing? This reduces the risk for the overall team as well because you're familiar with different parts of the code. It helps you to align yourselves with the design of the code, know pitfalls that may be emerging. You can jump in and start really helping the team when a need arises in different areas. That can be really beneficial as well. So the person writing the code benefits, the person reviewing the code benefits, but also the team benefits in this process as well. You can refactor the code to reduce the cost of change over time. So when you're reviewing, you are getting yourselves exposed to different parts of the code, and you're like, gosh, we could actually refactor this code. We can make it reusable. I know we are doing this over here, but you're duplicating that effort here. Let's bring that together and refactor it. You're able to identify some of those parts as well. It gives you that collective ownership I talked about a few minutes ago, and anybody on the team can jump in and help really maintain the code. That reduces the risk of development over time as well. It reduces the cost of the single point of failure. Oh, Johnny is not here at work today. You cannot change that code. Doesn't matter, the customer really wants this fix right away. Well, anyone who is willing and able on the team can jump in and fix the code as well, and it reduces the truck factor. So what is a truck factor? A truck factor is, unfortunately, the number of people on your project that should die before your project gets completely canceled and unmaintainable. And in a lot of projects, unfortunately, that number is 1. I was consulting for a company here in Europe. I won't be much more specific because I tell you the country name, you'll know the company name and vice versa. So I'll be non-committal about this particular company. And this was a few years ago. I was sitting right in the middle of the room as a consultant, and I had the manager on one side, and I had 2 programmers sitting on the other side. And the manager was trying to convince these 2 programmers, I really need help on this new project. I need either one or both of you on this project. I can really benefit from this. And these 2 gentlemen were sitting there, kind of like right where you are, and they were like, no, we cannot give you any time. We need to be working on the product we are working on. Now, this is a company with hundreds of thousands of people working for them. You got to keep that in mind. And I saw this back and forth, the manager saying, I need help, the developer saying they cannot. At some point, I just couldn't take it anymore. So I intervened, and I looked at the gentleman, and I said, excuse me, I'm sorry, but I'm really curious. What is it that you do? And the person on the left said, we both work on the same product, and I work on one part of the code, and he works on the other. And we both work on the product. We've been working on this for years, and we have an understanding between the 2 of us. I never touch his code, and he never touches my code. And he was so proud of this. And I looked at him and said, wow, that's interesting. I looked at the other person. He said, yep, that's exactly right. We both share our responsibility. We don't touch any other's code. And I said, with all respect, let's say you walk out of the door today and you get stuck by a truck and you die. what's going to be happening. And he proudly said, not only do I die, he dies with me. So that's kind of scary, right? So you are working on a project where the other person cannot maintain the code because they will never understand the code you are writing. That is, sorry, not job security. Because at some point you will be threatened to stay on the job, right? And you don't want to do the job anymore. That is not going to help us. That's the truck factor you want to avoid definitely. Because if you cannot be around who can maintain the code, and a good developer wants their code to live longer than they do in that company, in that product, in the team, that is very important. So that is something we can facilitate quite a bit when we have these kinds of ability to have collective ownership and other people look at it as well. But who is going to do it? How do we do it? What are some of the mechanisms? That's what I want to focus on, some of my lessons over the time. The very first thing I want to say is never review code that is not being compiled when compilation is needed, for example. And never review code that has not passed test cases, assuming you have test cases, right? No, of course, we all have. And has passed through code quality tools. So let me emphasize this. When I get my code for review, if my code doesn't compile, I'm not reviewing it. Absolutely not. That is not to say that somebody cannot come to me and say, hey, my code is not compiling, can you help me? That is a help for fixing the code, not a code review. So the code has to compile. All tests have to pass as well before I can review. And send your code through quality control tools, your linters if you want to, or your Sonar Cube, whatever that is that you use to measure the quality of code and design. I want the code to have gone through it. I want the code to go through a continuous integration with the tools, with the compilation, with the testing before I would review the code. What is the reason for it? The reason is actually extremely simple. Imagine you have a niece or a nephew or a younger member of the family writing a composition or an essay, and they come to you and say, hey, can you please review this and tell me what you think about it? And the minute you start reviewing, you start marking all the spelling typos on it. You circle all the grammatical errors. You return these pages in complete red to them and say, here you go, fix all these grammatical errors, fix all these typos. To me, that is not a valuable feedback. Yes, it was a feedback, but what did you end up doing? You end up really checking for things a machine could have checked for. They could have used a spell checker. They could have used a grammar checker. So if they, on the other hand, take the time to review this a few times, remove all the typos, make sure the grammar is relatively good, and they come to you and give you the report and say, can you review this for me? Now you're not circling the typos, you're not circling the grammatical errors because there are very few of those, but instead now you're talking about, hey, you're discussing this idea over here, but I think the flow will be really better if you talk about this ahead and move this later on. Hey, have you heard about this particular incident you should be really talking about? Now the quality of feedback is extremely better and different. The exact same thing happens to code as well. When the code has been compiled, when the code has gone through automated tests, when the code has passed through all the quality tools, the type of feedback you provide is enormously better rather than saying that these things are done very poorly. So go through style checkers as well before you ask somebody to review your code. That's generally the first thing I say. If I get a code which doesn't go through those things, I immediately say, I'll review the code later on, but here are the things you need to do before I could start reviewing it, is the very first thing I would emphasize. Then, of course, I will be honest about it. This is something I started doing several years ago. I don't review code anymore as a first step. When a code review comes to me, I first review the test, and only then I review the code. I don't start reviewing the code directly anymore. So when somebody says, hey, I finished this particular feature, or I'm making progress on it, can you review this for me? I say, sure, and I immediately jump into the test directory. And if there is no test, the review ends right there. And I'm going to say, sorry, I didn't find any tests. If you need help to write the test, let me know. But let me know when it's ready, I'll review the code again. So I start by reviewing the test first. And I work with some really great people. They write really good quality code, but they can improve on the test they write. So a lot of times my review to them is, hey, I'm looking at this test. Have you considered these other scenarios you should be testing for? Oh, this test is a little bit more complex. Oh, this test is really hard to read. And so a lot of feedback goes into the quality of test before the quality of code. And there are times, honestly, when I stop the review after I review the test, and I tell them, let's go fix these tests before I continue the review, and they go back and rework the test, because as they rework the test, the design of the code can improve as well, and then I can come back and review the test again, and then review the code at that point. So almost invariably, I start by reviewing test before I start reviewing code, and that's been a very effective way to promote automated testing in teams as well, because there's somebody reviewing the test before they review the code as well. So are the tests really easy to understand? Are they short enough? Does it have a good structure in the test? If the test is hard to read, that doesn't really help having those test cases. So typically, I want a section where you have an arrangement of your test, then there's an action that's being performed, then there is an assert, and there are times when, honestly, maybe a developer who's new to the team is feeling the pressure, and they say, oh my gosh, I need to have a good coverage, so they write the test and there's no assert at all. And my response is, dude, I found a test with no asserts, what's the point about this? Oh, I wanted to help with the coverage, like don't. So essentially, that's something you want to look at as well as the quality of the test cases. Does the test tell you a story of how the code has evolved? Honestly, a lot of times I tell my developers, when I open your test file, I want to see a story of how you evolved your code using these test cases. So there's got to be a story. When I start reading the test name, I can see the steps you took to write the code incrementally. I want to see that story being played out in your test as well. And of course, are there tests that are missing, maybe some edge case you didn't consider? So start by reviewing test before you review the code is a good way to introduce good practices into the team. If you really care about teams doing automated testing, well, start reviewing the test before you review the code. Could be a nice, real way to introduce that as well. Then, of course, when do we ask for reviews? This is another thing that I want to emphasize is they say pathway to hell is created on good intentions. There are times when some companies, some teams, they really genuinely want to do good things, but they end up really making things worse in the process of doing good things. One practice that I'm not a fan of at all and is to tie code review to just about anything. In one company, for example, they said, your code cannot go into production if there has not been a review on it. Well, guess what happened? Nobody has reviewed the code. It's not gone into production for weeks and weeks and weeks. And hey, why is nothing in production? Well, we're waiting for code review. And the boss gets really angry and goes to the developer and says, review it now. And the review is, looks good. What is the point? We didn't achieve anything by doing this process. So you cannot force people to do stupid things, because if you do, they do stupid things. So essentially, the idea is to really ask the question, why are we doing it? How can we truly facilitate to get the results? So if I tie this to, you can't release your code unless it's reviewed. Well, we haven't reviewed for a while, we have not released it. Review it now. I don't have time for it. Here you go, it looks good. So essentially what you want to think about is, how can you really make the code review effective? Now, I worked with some amazing programmers. These are the leaders in the industry I know who have written frameworks, who have written computer languages. But what I've learned working with them very closely is they would send an email to the team and say, hey, I just finished working on this complex algorithm. I'm feeling stupid at the moment. I can really use a pair of eyes to look at it. Who wants to volunteer? That is, in the middle of the day, they are asking for help, somebody to review the code, because they just finished implementing a complex algorithm. They feel like they can benefit from another person looking at it. And when I see that email from that expert of a library, a framework, or a language, I truly feel like, wow, this is the reason why we have code reviews, because this person really wants another pair of eyes to look at it. So when is a good time to review the code? So don't tie this to feature releases. If you tie this to feature releases, then people are just waiting and piling on it, and we never have time. That is even worse than not having any reviews, because it sends a false signal that code is being reviewed when there is no review at all. In reality, that's even worse. So don't tie this to anything. Instead, make it very incremental. Now, one of the key things we want to ask is the question. I don't use the word, I don't have time. Honestly, I don't. If somebody comes to me and says, do you have time? I say, I don't have any more or less time. There's so much time I have, and I'm not going to have less time suddenly today, right? I won't tell you I don't have time. What I will tell you is, I don't have you as a priority. And that is genuinely the answer. You want to spend your day not thinking about your time, spend your day thinking about your priorities. And I always reply to people, thanks for asking, but you're not my priority right now. I don't say I don't have time for it. I have the time, but you're not my priority. So the question you want to ask as a developer is, what's your priority being at work? If you're at work, if your priority is to crank out code all the time, that is your priority. But if your priority is to be part of a team where you develop good quality code, that becomes your priority. When I shift my priority, I take the time in my day to review code. I take the time in my day to write code. I take the time in my day to exercise. And I take my day in the day to socialize, to go out, to be with the family. Why? Because that's my priority. If we don't ask the question, what's my priority, we get very misguided. So when a team has a right priority, then we say, hey, my job is not to crank out code. My job is to work with the team so we collectively develop better software. So I'm going to divide my time to writing some code. I'm going to divide my time to reviewing other people's code. So every day my job is to write some code, but to review some code as well. I don't overload my schedule to write more code or overload my schedule to do more reviews. I split the time between those two and among other things. As a result, when I write code, others are reviewing. When they write code, I'm reviewing. We collectively make this a daily practice. So it really comes down to priority. And when we prioritize things properly, we then really focus on what we need to really be delivering and what is next thing to really think about. So code reviews are very effective when the developers ask for it. This is one thing that I've realized over time is when genuinely people ask for reviews, they have really started sensing the benefit they get out of review. There are times when people come to me and say, hey, can you please review this? I say, why do you want me to review this now? And they say, because the last time you reviewed it, I learned so much, I really want to get this opportunity to get reviewed. Genuinely and honestly, that's what I do. I go to people and say, hey, last time I wrote this, you reviewed it. I learned so much from it. Would you be kind enough to take the time to review it for me? And when I genuinely know that I gain from reviews, I ask for it. So if people are not asking for reviews, ask the question. Maybe they're not seeing the value. But why are they not seeing the value? Is it too intimidating? Is it too much of a trouble for them? Do they feel threatened because of the review? So this is not a technical concern at this point. It's a sociological concern. And we want to really genuinely make it possible for people to ask for these reviews because they benefit from it. Then they are going to be willingly ask for reviews more and more, and that becomes a lot better as well. And one other thing I would say here is that show a little code, get a lot of feedback. Show a lot of code, get only a little feedback. So essentially, when people come to me and say, can you review? I tell them, don't ask me to review massive amount of things. If you are developing this code incrementally, let's do incremental reviews. Because if you give me a little bit of code, I'm going to tell you a lot of stuff you can improve. But if you give me a boatload of code, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's a lot of code to read and review. I'm going to tell you a few high-level things to change. We are done. But here's another reason why that happens. If you take 3 months to write the code, or even 3 weeks to write the code, or even a week to write the code, and you come back and say, hey, I've written this code, can you review this, please? And if I look at your code and say, I got an idea, you are heading in this direction, let's delete and start over, let's go in this direction. You're going to say, are you out of your mind? I will never come back to ask for reviews to you, right? That is overwhelming change. But on the other hand, you just spent a day on this critical part, and at the end of the day, you are saying, hey, can you take a look at it? I got a lot more to do, but am I heading in the right direction? And I look at your work at the end of the day or end of a few hours and I say, hey, I just looked at what you have. You are using this kind of data structure, but have you considered this other data structure to use? Maybe you can go in this complete different direction. And you're like, gosh, that just blows away 5 hours of my work. But guess what? That's better. I'll start over. So essentially what it comes down to is ask early and frequent review if you want feedback. Ask in the end if you want my blessing. So if somebody comes to me and says, hey, I've done all this work, can you review it? I say, you have my blessings. Good job, be happy, and keep going. Because you're done with all that code. And if I now tell you, I got an idea for you, let's think about a completely different direction, you're like, I'm out of here, right? So all I can give you is my blessing at that point. Good job, buddy, you're awesome, keep going. But if you come back early and say, hey, here's the code, what can I do? Well, I'm glad you asked, have you considered this? We can have a talk about it, and we can go in a completely different direction. So the point really is, ask early and frequent review if you want feedback. Ask in the end, you will only get my blessing because practically speaking, we cannot give substantial reviews to make a significant improvement unless the work is completely awesome, which I'll be honest about it, is extremely rare. It's not impossible, but quite rare. So this is one of the reasons I would really like to have frequent reviews as well. So be continuous and not episodic. And this really takes effort to be continuous and not be episodic. So essentially, if you're working on something really critical, always ask the question, what's the cost of failure? If you're doing something little trivial, nothing really great, if it doesn't work really well, that's no big deal. No worries. Don't spend too much time and effort on it. But if you're working on something really critical, then ask for multiple reviews along the way. Because if you don't, you're increasing the risk and the cost of change later on. So you want to really be continuous rather than being episodic on that. And so review in stages, not in features. So if you are starting on a feature, or if I'm starting on a feature, I would say, here are all the things we're going to develop to implement this feature, but I'm going to take this first step. I'm going to get review right now. Because if I need to change direction to completely a different way to do it, now is a good time. And if I don't really do it now and I keep going, it's going to increase the cost of changing that later on. So you need to determine what those stages are where you can ask for the feedback continuously along the way. That is something for you to think about. So how do you actually review your code along the way? So yes, look for styles, but go beyond the styles in general. So get the things out of the way. Are they good variable names? Are the method names really good? Does it have a good level of abstraction? Are we keeping the code dry? Are we following the Yagni principle? Go after all your solid principles and look for them, but in a meaningful way. But I'll share with you another practice I follow. I've been following this for about 9-10 years now, and I found this to be really effective, which is when you find a bug. Oh, talking about when you find a bug, just to share with you a light moment, I was teaching a course in Switzerland, and as I was teaching, somebody said there's a bug. And I was live coding during the class, and I said, oh, there's a bug. And I kept looking at it, and more people in the room said there's a bug. And I finally said, where is the bug? Please tell me the line number. And somebody yelled out line number 31. And there was literally a bug on the screen, which I felt very embarrassing right behind me. So anyway, what do you do when you find a bug? years ago when I found a bug, I would write a little paragraph describing, oh, your code, if you send this input, blah, 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 does this. And I quickly realized, oh my gosh, rather than writing about this, what if I write a test that fails because of the bug? I'll tell you, the moment I did this the first time was absolutely rewarding, unforgettable. I was reviewing a developer's code, I found a bug, I wrote a test and didn't say a word. Wrote the test failed, I checked it in, kept quiet. And the continuous integration failed, it went up in flames. I'm like, this is cool. And the developer got an email, their build is failing. And the developer looks at the build and says, oh, the old man Venkat changed something. What is it? An hour later, he comes to me and says, hey, I see what you did there. I said, what was that? Well, looks like you found a bug, didn't you? I said, yes, I did. And you wrote a test for it. I said, I hope that was useful. And he said, did you know there were 3 more bugs in there? And I'm like, no, I didn't. And then he said, well, I guess what you tried to tell me there is when you find a bug, write a test first. I said, what do you think of that? He said, I love it. And now that became a practice in the team. We don't fix bugs anymore. We first write a test for it when we find one. Once the test fails, we fix the bug. And that's a practice you can promote during code review. Write a test for a failing bug, a failing test for a bug, rather than trying to talk about it. So, of course, be constructive. Don't say what a terrible code this is. Don't say your code smells like a garbage truck. It doesn't help anybody by being negative like that. Instead, give them ideas. What can be better? Give some suggestions, but give them an opportunity to explore other ideas as well. So be very constructive and promote good communication. Make it safe and honest to provide code reviews. Don't go to somebody and say, I just reviewed Joseph's code. I don't know who hired him. What a terrible code he's writing. You lost the trust of the team by doing this. Make it safe to be honest in your team. Your team will appreciate your presence because it is safe to be open with you, to learn with you. So be very safe and very honest. Make it very constructive. Hope that was useful. That's all I have. Thank you.